Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I hope that you'll find this video to be useful, and by the end of it, you'll consider subscribing. And to everyone else, I hope you'll consider clicking the thumbs up button. What I'm going to talk about today are some of the common mistakes that people make when they build guitars. And really doesn't matter whether you're experienced at building guitars or whether you're a newbie. These are mistakes that I know people make based on some of the comments that I've received on other videos that I've made, as well as emails that folks send to me with questions about guitar building. And I've also had the opportunity to watch videos that other folks have posted documenting their guitar building process, and I see mistakes made, and oftentimes they will admit to making these mistakes. So I just want to kind of touch on those, and these are the 5 that I think are the most critical. The first one is a failure to follow a specific order of steps. And when you build a guitar, there are a huge number of steps that you have to follow when building the guitar from start to finish. And if you don't follow the steps in a certain order, there is a possibility, I'm not going to say it's a guarantee, just a possibility that things aren't going to turn out the way you'd hoped. And this is one of the problems that I see folks running into that often prevents them from finishing one of their guitar builds. Let me give you an example. When I build a guitar, I always make the fretboard first, all the way to completion, just like you see it here. Then I'll make the neck, and I'll do the same thing. I'll carve the neck all the way to completion. Once that's done, I can bring the two together. The reason I do it this way is because if I run into a problem while making the fretboard, and by that I mean maybe I've slotted it incorrectly, maybe they're positioned incorrectly, or while radiusing the fretboard I expose a flaw in the wood, or maybe when I was drilling the marker dots I drilled them in the wrong location. Any one of a number of different issues. I've only lost just this one part. I see a lot of guys who will take a fretboard blank and then glue it onto a neck blank. Then they'll start the process of slotting, radiusing, and then shaping the neck. But if you make a mistake anywhere in that process, you've lost both parts. And then if you've got carbon fiber reinforcement and a truss rod inside the neck, you've lost those as well. Now sure, you could liberate at least the truss rod by ripping off the fretboard and pulling the truss rod out, but you're not going to be able to get the carbon fiber reinforcement strips out because they're probably going to be glued in. So as you can see, it becomes really important to follow steps in a certain order in order to prevent the possibility of running into a problem. And speaking of the fretboard, for example, when I make the fretboard, what I typically like to do is first I'll drill the holes for my marker dots, or if I'm going to be doing inlay, I'll carve those pockets before I do anything else. Then I'll glue in the material for those marker dots or the inlay, and from there I'll slot the fretboard and then I'll radius the fretboard. And the reason I do it that way is when you're gluing in the material for your fret marker dots or for your inlay, it can be kind of messy. If you've already slotted the fretboard first, you're going to get glue in those slots, and that's going to cause issues. So I like to do the marker dots and the inlay first, then I'll slot it, then I'll radius it. And when I radius the fretboard, that's going to automatically reduce the material that I used for the marker dots as well as the inlay to be flush with the radius of the fretboard. So what I really recommend that you do is that you, before you even start to build, is you list out all the steps that you're going to have to follow when building the guitar. Now this can be kind of difficult to do if you've never made a guitar before, so you're going to have to do some research. But as you're preparing this list, think about how one step is going to be affected by the other steps. And what you're likely going to do is you're going to rearrange your list one or two times before you come up with the final list. And that's going to help you to see exactly what you need to do when you need to do it and to avoid mistakes that can get made. Now, mistake number 2 is failing to test. If you've never made a guitar before, chances are a lot of the techniques that you're going to need to use and some of the tools, as well as some of the finishing products and things like that. If you've never used them before, it's a good idea to test. And you're going to want to test on scrap material. Using a router, for example, to cut out, the shape of a guitar body. And here, this is a pretty complex shape that I did on my CNC machine. But understanding how the router cuts that shape as you're moving it is going to help you to avoid mistakes. When you route a shape like the edge of this guitar body, you have to be careful about how the router bit is engaging the wood. And if you're not aware of how that works, you can tear pieces of the wood out, big chunks. And I've seen a lot of guys do this. So understanding how to route, the direction that you need to move the router is really important. So you're going to want to test on scrap. First, you're going to want to do the research to figure out exactly what direction your router is turning and how that direction engages the wood, especially around these edges here. And then you'll want to practice on scrap to get a feel for how it's going to work before you commit to routing an expensive piece of wood like mahogany or a nice flamed maple and that sort of thing. Also, when it comes to applying finishes on a guitar, you may have an idea in your mind of what you want to do, but if you've never done it before, I highly recommend that you test on scrap. Preferably, for example, scrap that is what your guitar is going to be made from. So, here I have the remainder from what I cut this body out of. I've saved this, and I'm going to use this to test my finish on to make sure I'm going to get the look that I'm after, as well as to understand how the finish dries and cures on the wood. It's extremely important to be able to test. And there's other things too, like if you've never routed the pockets for your pickups or a recess for a floating tremolo bridge, you're going to want to test the techniques that you're going to do before you actually do them. Don't use your guitar as the guinea pig. There's a good chance you could ruin it. So it's better to ruin a cheap pine 2x4 or a piece of poplar than it is an expensive piece of rosewood or ebony or anything like that. Mistake number 3 is relying on published component specs. And by that I mean, for example, the specs of a bridge that you're thinking about using, or the specs of some of the electronic components that you're thinking of using. Oftentimes, those specs can be completely wrong, and a lot depends on who you're purchasing from. Now, I try to buy from top-notch resellers, so usually the specs that I get are pretty accurate. No matter what, though, what I like to do is acquire all the parts, all the components, all the wood, all the materials, and have everything on hand before I start a build. That way I can measure them to make sure that the design that I'm going to be building is actually going to work. Because nothing is more disappointing than to assume that your guitar bridge is going to have a string spread of, say, 53, 54 millimeters or 2 1/16 inches, only to find out that when you receive the bridge, those specs were not correct. Because then all of a sudden, you may have problems getting your string to line up properly over the fretboard. And that can be a disaster when it comes to building your guitar. Same is true with, for example, drilling the holes through the body into the control cavity for your pots and switches. You may read a specification somewhere, but then when you actually get the part, it's different. So, and if you've already drilled the holes, they're not going to fit properly. So you want to make sure that you don't rely on published specs. Always rely on specs that you take yourself with your own measuring tools and do it before you start to build the guitar. That way, if you need to modify your design, you can do so before you've ever cut any wood. Mistake number 4 is relying on recorded audio samples to make a decision about your components. And really what we're talking about here is pickups. A lot of pickup manufacturers out there will post audio samples of their pickups. And I would call that, realistically, it's a good starting point, but it's not one that you're going to want to rely on. I have had too many people tell me how disappointed they were when they received a pickup that they purchased because of an audio sample, only to find out that once they built the guitar and installed those pickups, it didn't sound anything like that audio sample. You have to remember that when a pickup manufacturer records an audio sample, they've installed that pickups into a guitar. That signal then has to go through the electronics, out the output cable to the amplifier, out the speaker. And then there's recording equipment that has to record it. There's software that processes it. And then that audio has to be compressed when it's uploaded to the internet. Then it has to be downloaded to your device, and then through whatever headphones or speakers that you're using. So obviously there's a whole chain that your signal is going to, or that the signal is going to go to before it ever reaches your ear. And there's also the issue of playing style. The person who's playing that guitar when they record the sample may have a completely different playing style than what you're going to have. So really, you can only use audio samples as sort of a starting point. But what you really need to do is to learn how to read specifications. You need to understand what the type of magnet that's used in the pickups, the Gauss level of the magnet, and really importantly, the inductance measurement of that pickup, and how that all relates together. And I've made videos on this topic before, so I'll post a link above that will, you can go back and check some of that out. But to rely on a recorded audio the potential for disappointment is just too great. So learn how to read the specifications of the pickups in order to help make the decision. And then once you've made your guitar, there's always a possibility that it's still not going to sound the way you had hoped. But knowing what you can do to dial in the tone, either by degaussing a magnet or replacing the magnet, or maybe just swapping out the pickups for something else, is going to help you to dial in the tone to exactly what you need. Mistake number 5 is trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. Now, how does that relate to guitar building? Really what it is you don't want to make the mistake of trying to pair up features that aren't going to work together. When you're planning out your guitar build, and this really goes back to the first mistake, when you're listing out all the steps in building the guitar, and you're trying to think through and visualize those processes and how they relate to one another, you also need to make sure that the features that you want to incorporate into your design are actually going to work well together. Now, let me give you a simple example that should explain it. Let's say you want to put a recessed Floyd Rose onto your guitar. But at the same time, you also want a thin line guitar body, like a 1.5 or a 1 3/8 inch thick body. that's probably not going to work. And the reason is the bridge block is too tall. It's going to extend out the back of the guitar. Now, it may be possible to swap out that bridge block for a shorter one, but you want to make sure that it's all going to work well together. Otherwise, you're going to be very disappointed in what's going to happen. And that's, there are other examples that I could mention as well, but what you want to do is you want to make sure that these cool features that you want to add are going to work. Another one would be, let's say you want all kinds of push-pull pots or micro switches that will allow you to coil tap the pickups or switch the phasing and that sort of thing. Great, that's cool. Make sure it's going to fit in the control cavity. The last thing you want to do is to incorporate all this stuff and only realize that your control cavity isn't going to fit everything. Then you end up with a mess. So you just want to make sure that you think through all the features you want to incorporate. And that way you'll reduce the possibility of making a guitar that isn't going to work. Now, I realize these 5 mistakes, which I've just mentioned, are really just common sense, but I also know that a lot of you have never made a guitar before or have used woodworking tools. So for that reason, I hope that this video is going to help save you from making some of these 5 mistakes. At any rate, if you found this video to be useful, please consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, again, welcome. Consider subscribing. And until the next episode, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back.